picture this. We are in Paris, and it is December 10th, 1948.
Right in the dead of winter.
Yeah, exactly. The setting is the Palais de Chaillot, and we are inside the United Nations General Assembly.
Oh, wow. Okay. Setting the scene.
And I want you, the listener, to really imagine the air in this room because it is just incredibly heavy.
I mean, the Cold War isn't just some abstract concept at this point,
Right.
It's a freezing reality. The Berlin blockade is actively happening.
Yeah. The stakes for global diplomacy have literally never been higher.
Yeah.
The world is desperately trying to figure out how to prevent the atrocities of the Second World War from, ever happening again.
It's a massive, massive undertaking.
It really is. And then, amidst all this profound ideological tension, something incredibly rare happens.
Okay.
The delegates, who are representing nations from all over the globe, right? Nations that are currently locked in these bitter geopolitical proxy conflicts, they actually rise to their feet.
A standing ovation.
A completely unified standing ovation. And the recipient of this historic applause...
This is the best part.
It's a 64-year-old American widow.
Yeah.
She has just spent years successfully navigating what was basically an impossible diplomatic minefield to pass the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Staring down Soviet diplomats late into the night.
Right. Wrangling the massive egos of international legal scholars. And by doing this, she essentially cements her legacy as the first lady of the world.
It really is a breathtaking moment in 20th century history.
It is. But I want you, our listener, to hold that triumphant image in your mind for just a second, because I want to pull you way back in time.
Wait, we're doing a contrast.
We have to. We need to look at the jarring, honest, almost unbelievable contrast of where this woman started.
Yeah, their origin story is wild.
Because long before she was an international icon who could just, casually out-debate foreign ministers, she was an incredibly insecure, orphaned teenager.
She sincerely referred to herself as an ugly duckling.
Yes. A girl who was so deeply traumatized and so terrified of the sea that she couldn't even board a ship without having a full-blown panic attack.
And welcome to this deep dive.
Yes, welcome.
Today, our mission is to completely unpack the incredible trajectory of Eleanor Roosevelt. We're going to look way past the standard, historical summaries.
Because no one needs another dusty textbook recitation of dates.
Exactly. We want to figure out exactly how this transformation happened, because this is a deeply human profile of a woman whose immense private grief and, honestly, crushing personal betrayals directly fueled this relentless, world-changing public crusade.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to me, looking at the broad strokes, Eleanor essentially invented the modern political spouse.
She really did. She created an operational blueprint that simply didn't exist before her.
Right, and she did it while navigating a wildly complicated, often heartbreaking personal life. But what I really want to understand is the foundation here. Like, how does someone who starts out so fundamentally broken end up building the framework for international human rights?
Well, what's fascinating here is that she wasn't born with this impenetrable armor. When you study her life, you see that her specific childhood traumas uniquely equipped her to become the conscience of the 20th century.
Wow.
Yeah, her resilience was forged in a very specific, very painful crucible.
The wounds actually became the tools.
Exactly. The wounds of her early life quite literally became the cognitive and emotional tools she used to reshape the world.
So to understand that crucible, I guess we need to set the scene for her childhood.
We do.
So imagine being born into the absolute highest tier of New York high society in the late 19th century.
The Gilded Age.
Right. Your family are the swells. You are surrounded by this immense, almost incomprehensible wealth. But within all of that privilege, you feel entirely invisible. You feel fundamentally unloved.
And that was her reality from the literal moment she was born in Manhattan in 1884.
Because her parents were socialites, right?
And Anna Rebecca Hall and Elliot Roosevelt. So on paper, she is American aristocracy.
Through her father, she's the niece of future President Theodore Roosevelt.
Exactly. The Roosevelts and the Livingstons were families that practically owned New York. But all that wealth and pedigree provided absolutely zero insulation against immediate, compounding emotional and physical traumas.
I want to talk about that emotional environment for a second, because from what I've read, it sounds incredibly bleak.
Oh, it was?
It wasn't just like a lack of warmth, it was active disdain. Her own mother, Anna, was reportedly this stunning, celebrated socialite.
Very focused on appearances.
Right. And she looked at her own daughter, this earnest little girl, and just decided she was too serious, too plain, What was the nickname she gave her?
She called her Granny.
Granny. I mean, can you
That's
imagine?
brutal.
You're a child and your own mother is actively mocking your appearance and demeanor. She's signaling to you and everyone else in that circle that you are a total disappointment to their aesthetic standards.
It absolutely established a profound insecurity right out of the gate. She was totally starved for affection. And then the physical traumas begin.
Right, the shipwreck.
Yeah, let's look at 1887. Eleanor is just 2 years old,
Too.
and her parents decide to take her on a transatlantic voyage on a ship called the SS Britannic. And off the coast, in thick fog, the ship is struck by another ocean liner, the SS Celtic.
A literal shipwreck at 2 years old.
A violent collision. I mean, panic ensues on the deck. The adults are completely terrified, and this 2-year-old girl is hoisted over the rail and dropped down into a lifeboat that's just tossing in the middle of the ocean.
Oh my gosh.
She is screaming, completely traumatized, before eventually being rescued and transferred to the other ship.
And this single terrifying event instilled in her a completely paralyzing phobia of ships and the sea.
Which is so important later.
Right. Keep in mind, decades later, when she's crossing the Atlantic and the Pacific for these crucial diplomatic missions during World War, she is actively fighting off intense panic attacks just to board the vessel.
It's a detail that really grounds her humanity for me.
Same. So you have the emotional distance from her mother, the physical trauma of the shipwreck, and then the bottom just completely falls out of her world.
Yeah, the death toll in her early childhood is honestly staggering.
It's a cascade of loss. When Eleanor is 8 years old, her mother contracts diphtheria.
Which is a brutal bacterial infection. It essentially coats the throat and airways.
Yeah, and she dies. And then just a few months later, Eleanor's little brother, Elliot Jr., contracts the exact same disease and also dies.
Leaving her solely with her father, Elliot Sr.
And from what I understand, he was really the one bright spot in her life.
He was.
He was the only one who showed her any real affection.
She absolutely adored him. He used to call her his little golden hair. But here Elliot was deeply troubled.
Right.
He suffered from severe alcoholism and a reliance on narcotics, to the point where the family eventually had him confined to a sanitarium, first in France and later in New York.
And then in 1894, when Eleanor is not quite 10 years old, Elliot suffers a severe episode of delirium tremens.
Yeah. And for those who might not know, delirium tremens is a terrifying, life-threatening form of severe alcohol withdrawal.
Right. It causes intense hallucinations, tremors, and just a complete break from reality.
Exactly. And in the grip of this delirium, he jumps from a high window of the facility.
Wow.
He actually survives the initial fall, but the trauma to his body is just too much, and he dies from the seizure shortly after.
So by the age of 10, Eleanor has lost her mother, her brother, and the father who was the absolute center of her universe.
She is orphaned, and she falls into a deep depression.
And historians note that this depression would shadow her for her entire life.
Oh, absolutely. It never really leaves her.
So she gets sent to live with her maternal grandmother, Mary Livingston Ludlow Hall, in Tivoli, New York.
And this house is described as gloomy, rigid, just incredibly oppressive.
This is where she really internalizes that ugly duckling persona.
Yeah, she's living in this grand estate, totally insecure. She feels like she has absolutely nothing to offer the world because she isn't classically beautiful by the rigid standards of Gilded Age high society.
But this oppressive environment actually sets up the first major turning point in her life, doesn't it?
It does. In 1899, at the age of 15, her family sends her across the Atlantic to London to attend the Allenswood Boarding Academy.
Okay.
And this is where the trajectory of her life fundamentally shifts, largely due to the headmistress there, a woman named Marie Souvestre.
Let's talk about Marie Souvestre, because I look at Allenswood as essentially a cognitive boot camp for Eleanor.
That's a perfect way to frame it.
It's like a superhero's origin story. She's taken out of this toxic, emotionally bankrupt environment in New York and placed with a mentor who hands her the operational blueprints for modern diplomacy without her even realizing it.
Yeah, Souvestre was not your typical Victorian schoolmarm. She was a fiercely independent, forward-thinking, politically progressive woman.
And she actively sought to cultivate independent thought in her students.
Right. She looks at this shy, awkward, grieving teenager and essentially tells her, your appearance is completely irrelevant. Your mind is your greatest asset.
Which is exactly what Eleanor needed to hear.
What's fascinating here is that Sylvester's mentorship was vital for reasons far beyond just boosting the teenager's self-esteem.
Okay, how so?
We need to look at the practical skills she imparted. First, she demanded that the girls speak fluent French.
Which was the international language of diplomacy at the time.
Exactly. Second, she trained Eleanor in rigorous, independent critical thinking. Sylvester would regularly invite Eleanor into her private study to discuss global politics.
Yeah.
And she demanded that Eleanor defend her opinions logically.
Wow, so she's not just lecturing her, she's debating her.
Yes. And she exposed her to travel, taking Eleanor on trips across Europe and literally forcing her to handle the logistics, the tickets, the translations, everything.
So she's literally training her to be a global operator.
Precisely. Sylvester modeled what it looked like for a woman to be politically engaged, intellectually formidable, and unapologetic.
These weren't just, finishing school pleasantries like how to pour tea or arrange flowers.
Not at all.
These were the exact cognitive tools and diplomatic strategies that Eleanor would deploy decades later at the UN.
And it worked. By the time Eleanor left Allenswood, she wasn't just surviving, she was thriving. Her cousin even reported that she was, quote, beloved by everybody at the school.
She had really found her footing and her confidence.
Yeah, she did.
So after this incredible period of growth, she's an educated, confident 18-year-old. How does she end up getting dragged right back into the miserable New York social scene? Like, does she just revert to the ugly duckling?
Well, she really didn't have a choice. In 1902, her grandmother summoned her back to New York to make her official social debut.
Ah, the debutante ball.
Right. The family expectation was absolute. You come back, you put on the expensive dress, you go to the Waldorf Astoria, and you find a suitable husband.
And I bet she hated it.
Eleanor later admitted that the entire debutante experience was utterly miserable. She had been away, she didn't know anyone in that social circle anymore.
And she probably felt totally alienated by a superficial society that valued everything she lacked and ignored everything Sylvester had taught her to value in herself.
It's the classic regression. But it's during this stifling return to New York society that she has a specific encounter that changes the map of her life once again.
Okay, here we go.
She's on a train heading up to Tivoli, and she runs into a distant relative, her fifth cousin once removed.
A very charismatic, famously handsome young Harvard student named Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
That's the one.
Yeah.
And that train ride sparks a secret romance. They begin writing to each other, spending time together, and they actually fall in love.
Okay, so by November 1903, Franklin proposes and Eleanor accepts. But they decide to keep the engagement a complete secret.
Yes, and the reason for the secrecy introduces the primary antagonist of Eleanor's early adulthood.
Oh boy.
Franklin's mother, Sarah Delano Roosevelt.
Okay, we have to talk about Sarah. Because from everything I've read, she is a formidable, almost terrifying matriarch who just wielded her wealth like a weapon.
Sarah was fiercely controlling. She violently opposed the idea of Franklin marrying at all, let alone to Eleanor.
Because she thought they were too young.
She said that, but more importantly, she simply didn't want to share her son's attention with another woman.
Wow.
So when Franklin finally told her about the engagement, Sarah made him promise to keep it completely unannounced for a year.
Just trying to run out the clock.
Exactly. She then packed Franklin up and took him on a long Caribbean cruise, explicitly hoping that the physical distance and time away would kill the romance.
It's a classic power play. But Franklin, to his credit at this specific moment in time, holds firm.
He does.
The cruise doesn't work. The engagement is announced, and the wedding goes forward on March 17th, 1905. But even the wedding day is a perfect microcosm of Eleanor being overshadowed.
Yes, because the wedding in New York City happens to coincide with the St. Patrick's Day parade. And Eleanor's uncle, the sitting president of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt, is in town for the parade. Since Eleanor's father is dead, Teddy steps in to give the bride away.
And Teddy Roosevelt is not exactly known for being a wallflower.
Not at all. He completely stole the headlines. The press barely mentioned the bride and groom. It was all about the president.
Naturally.
Teddy even famously joked at the reception, quote, "It is a good thing to keep the name in the family."
Unbelievable. So they get married, they go on their honeymoon, and then they come back to New York. And this is where the reality of her marriage and the sheer dominance of Sarah Delano Roosevelt really sets in.
Oh, yeah.
How exactly did Sarah exert this control over their daily lives? Because it wasn't just standard mother-in-law meddling, right?
No. No. Sarah essentially orchestrated their entire domestic existence. She bought them a beautiful townhouse in New York City on East 65th Street. But she also bought the townhouse immediately next door for herself.
Okay, that's close.
It gets worse. She didn't just live next door. She had the architect design the homes with sliding doors on the dining room and drawing room floors that literally connected the two houses.
Okay, wait, the mechanics of that are chilling.
Right.
You literally cannot shut your mother-in-law out of your life. There are zero boundaries.
None. Sarah was running both households. She dictated the decor, the staff, and eventually how Eleanor and Franklin raised their children.
And they had 6 children between 1906 and 1916, right?
Yes, though tragically one died in infancy. And Sarah constantly undermined Eleanor's authority as a mother. Eleanor's son James later recounted a moment where Sarah gathered the grandchildren and explicitly told them, quote, "Your mother only bore you. I am more your mother than your mother is."
That is, that is emotional warfare. It's completely demoralizing.
And it worked. Her own letters reveal that Eleanor felt entirely inadequate as a mother. She admitted that understanding and playing with little children just didn't come naturally to her.
And compounding this domestic misery was the state of her romantic marriage. She once confided to her daughter Anna that physical intimacy with Franklin was an, quote, ordeal to be borne.
So you really have to picture her reality during these years. She is trapped in this connected house, constantly undermined by her mother-in-law, feeling like a failure as a mother, and entirely unfulfilled in her romantic life.
While she is just playing the role of the dutiful political wife as Franklin begins his rise, right? Serving in the New York State Senate, and then moving to Washington when he's appointed Assistant Secretary of the Navy.
Exactly. Which brings us to the absolute turning point of her adult life.
The crucible.
Yes. It's 1918. World War I is raging. Franklin comes back from a tour of naval facilities in Europe, and he is deathly ill with double pneumonia.
Okay.
Eleanor is unpacking his suitcase, doing the standard duties of a caring wife, and she finds a bundle of letters.
And these were not casual notes.
No. They were detailed, passionate love letters, and the author was a woman named Lucy Mercer.
And who is Lucy Mercer?
She had been Eleanor's own trusted social secretary.
Let's pause on the gravity of this, because this isn't a random acquaintance. This is a woman Eleanor hired, a woman who was in her home helping her organize her life.
Exactly.
And she discovers her husband has been actively contemplating leaving her for this woman. What is Eleanor's immediate reaction? Like, does she confront him?
She confronts him directly.
Right.
And she immediately offers him a divorce.
Wow. Good for her.
But this is where the political and financial machinery surrounding Franklin kicks into high gear.
Yeah.
Franklin's chief political advisor, Louis Howe, steps in.
Okay, the strategist.
Right. Howe is a brilliant, ruthless strategist, and he bluntly warns Franklin that a divorce in 1918, especially under scandalous circumstances, would instantly end his political career.
And I bet Sarah Eleanor Roosevelt has something to say about this, too.
Oh, she intervenes heavily. She tells Franklin that if he abandons his wife and children for Lucy Mercer, she will completely disinherit him, cut him off entirely.
So Howe provides the political threat, and Sarah provides the financial threat. And faced with losing his career and his fortune, Franklin agrees to stay.
A formal agreement is reached. The marriage will continue legally and publicly. Lucy Mercer is banished from their lives, and Franklin promises never to see her again.
But the romantic and physical relationship between Eleanor and Franklin is permanently over.
Yes. The marriage transforms entirely into a political partnership.
This is a fascinating pivot. She discovers this devastating betrayal, but instead of a messy public divorce, they forge this alliance. Looking at the historical record, was this purely a cold, pragmatic business decision, or was there still a foundation of genuine care between them?
Historians have debated this for decades, actually. And reading their correspondence over the subsequent years suggests it was a deeply complex mix of both.
Right.
It was undeniably pragmatic. They both had massive public ambitions, but there's also a profound, abiding respect that evolved between them. They became partners in a shared mission.
They cared fiercely for each other's success.
Even if they had accepted that they could not fulfill each other's romantic or emotional needs. And the strength of that partnership becomes incredibly apparent just 3 years later.
Right. Let's move to 1921. The family is vacationing at their estate on Campobello Island in Canada.
Yeah.
Franklin goes for a swim, feels exhausted, and within days he is struck by a severe paralytic illness, which was diagnosed at the time as polio. His legs are permanently paralyzed.
It's devastating.
And the way Eleanor steps up here completely defies the image of the emotionally detached political wife.
She essentially takes command of the entire medical crisis. She nurses him meticulously through the acute, agonizing phase of the illness.
The attending physician at Campobello literally credited Eleanor's tireless care with saving Franklin's life during those critical first weeks.
She absolutely did. But saving his life was really only the first battle. The second battle was for his future, and this is where she finally goes head-to-head with Sarah Eleanor Roosevelt and wins.
Okay, how's that play out?
Well, Sarah's reaction to the paralysis was to demand that Franklin retire permanently to the Hyde Park estate, become an invalid country gentleman, and completely fade from public view. She just wanted to protect him.
And Eleanor says no.
Eleanor absolutely refused to let that happen. She understood that politics was Franklin's lifeblood. If he retired to Hyde Park, his spirit would die long before his body did.
So what's her play?
To keep him engaged and to keep his name alive in Democratic political circles while he spent years rehabilitating, Eleanor realized she had to become his public proxy.
The mechanism of this is just astounding to me. The death of their romantic intimacy freed her from the traditional expectations of a submissive wife, and then his physical paralysis literally forced her into the public arena.
Exactly.
Like, if Lucy Mercer hadn't broken the marriage, and if polio hadn't broken his legs, Eleanor might have remained a quiet society matron.
It's a perfect example of cause and effect.
Yeah.
But we should note, she didn't become a political force overnight. The 1920s served as her intense training ground.
Because Franklin couldn't travel easily.
Right. So his advisor, Louis Howe, started actively coaching Eleanor. He taught her how to speak publicly, how to analyze a crowd, how to report back to Franklin on the political conditions of different districts.
And she became deeply involved with progressive organizations like the Women's Trade Union League.
And she finally starts building her own independent life. She essentially says, I need my own physical space away from my mother-in-law.
Yes, finally.
So she, along with her close political friends Marion Dickerman and Nancy Cook, build a cottage on the Hyde Park estate, but physically separate from the main house. They call it Valkill.
And it becomes her sanctuary.
Yeah. She also buys the Todd Hunter School for Girls in New York City and takes on a role as a teacher. She is teaching American literature and history 3 days a week. She is carving out an intellectual identity entirely separate from being Mrs. Franklin D. Roosevelt.
And while she is teaching and organizing, she is also becoming a remarkably shrewd political operator within the New York State Democratic Party.
Which leads to one of the most revealing anecdotes of the 1920s.
Yes. In 1924, Eleanor aggressively campaigned for the Democrat Al Smith, who was running for governor of New York. And the Republican nominee running against him happened to be her own first cousin, Theodore Roosevelt Jr.
This is the Teapot Dome prank.
I think this specific event is crucial because it completely shatters the image of Eleanor as this saintly, purely serious figure.
It really does.
So for context, the Teapot Dome scandal was a massive corruption controversy involving federal oil leases during the Harding administration. Theodore Jr. wasn't directly implicated, but he was politically adjacent to it as a Republican official.
So Eleanor decides to tie that scandal around his neck.
And how she does it is amazing.
She executes a highly visual, incredibly aggressive political stunt. Eleanor outfits a car with a giant papier-mâché bonnet shaped like a teapot.
Right.
She rigs the contraption to emit simulated steam, and she physically trails her cousin's campaign car around the state of New York, blasting steam to remind every voter who sees him of the corruption scandal.
She is literally trolling her own cousin with a steaming papier-mâché teapot. It's a ruthless political hit job.
And it was incredibly effective. Theodore Jr. lost the election by over 100,000 votes, and he honestly never forgave her for the humiliation.
Her aunt, Corrine Roosevelt Robinson, publicly broke ties with her over it.
Yeah, Eleanor later admitted in her writings that the tactic was a bit below her dignity, and she tried to blame it on Democratic dirty tricksters. But the reality is she played the game.
She proved to the political establishment that she was willing to get into the mud and execute hardball tactics to achieve a larger goal.
It shows a level of sharp-elbowed pragmatism that you just don't normally associate with her.
Exactly. So she spends the 1920s building this formidable political machine. Fast forward to 1932. Franklin wins the presidency in the depths of the Great Depression. You would think Eleanor would be thrilled, right? All her hard work paid off.
But her own letters reveal she fell into a deep depression because she understood the historical trap of the First Lady. Historically, the role was strictly domestic, silent, and ornamental. Her immediate predecessor, Lou Henry Hoover, had essentially stated her intention to be nothing more than a, quote, backdrop for Bertie, referring to her husband, Herbert Hoover.
And Eleanor had just spent a decade building her independence, teaching, organizing labor, and operating politically.
She was terrified of being shoved back into a gilded cage, forced to just pour tea and smile for cameras. Her close friend Lorena Hickok even subtitled her biography of Eleanor, Reluctant First Lady.
But because she refuses to be a backdrop, she completely re-engineers the role of the presidential spouse.
She smashes the mold.
First of all, she decides she is not going to rely on the government for her income. In her first year as First Lady, she earned $75,000 from independent lectures and writing.
To put that in perspective, that perfectly matched FDR's presidential salary.
And she gives almost all of it away to charity. But her most brilliant structural move was how she handled the press.
Yes, let's look at the mechanics of her media strategy, because it was revolutionary. She became the first presidential spouse to hold regular press conferences. She ultimately held 348 of them over 12 years.
But she instituted one strict, non-negotiable rule.
Male reporters were banned, only women could attend.
This is a masterclass in using leverage to force institutional change. During the Great Depression, newspapers were firing women left and right. But Eleanor makes herself highly visible. She's constantly making news.
So if a newspaper wants access to the First Lady's press conference, they are economically forced to hire or retain a female reporter on staff.
It was a structural mechanism to keep women employed in journalism.
It was brilliant, and she used that constant press access to build what we would now recognize as a massive multimedia platform. She was producing an unprecedented volume of content.
Right.
But to understand how she sustained that staggering public output, we really have to look at the emotional infrastructure she built in her private life during the White House years.
Because her marriage to FDR was a political partnership, she sought genuine emotional intimacy elsewhere.
Yes, let's dive into that private world. The most famous and intensely studied relationship is with the woman we just mentioned, Lorena Hickok, who went by Hick.
And Hickok was a brilliant, tough Associated Press reporter who had been assigned to cover Eleanor during the 1932 campaign.
They developed a deeply intense bond. At FDR's inauguration, Eleanor actually wore a sapphire ring that Hickok had given her.
And the letters between them are extraordinary. We are talking about daily letters, sometimes 10 to 15 pages long. Eleanor wrote things like, quote, "I want to put my arms around you and kiss you at the corner of your mouth." She wrote about aching to hold her.
The relationship became so intense that Hickok eventually had to resign from the Associated Press because she was too emotionally compromised to report objectively on the administration.
And Eleanor subsequently helped secure her a job as an investigator for a New Deal relief program.
Now, the exact nature of this relationship has been the subject of intense historiographical debate. In the 1980s, a biographer named Doris Faber discovered and published some of this correspondence, but she aggressively downplayed it.
Right, dismissing it as an unusually belated schoolgirl crush and cautioning readers not to project modern definitions of sexuality onto the past, which feels like an incredible stretch when you read the actual explicit longing in the quotes.
It does. Modern historians, such as Blanche Cook and Hazel Rowley, view the historical record very differently. What's fascinating here is that they argue there are undeniable romantic and erotic components to the relationship.
You have to look at the context. Eleanor was in a marriage that had been completely devoid of physical and romantic intimacy since 1918.
Furthermore, she wasn't naive. She understood same-sex relationships perfectly well. Her childhood mentor, Marie Souvestre, lived with a female partner, and Eleanor had several close friends in long-term, committed same-sex relationships.
Right.
To dismiss the Hickok letters merely as a crush ignores the deep, emotional, and highly likely physical reality of Eleanor's life at that time.
And Hickok wasn't the only intense relationship outside her marriage. There was also Earl Miller.
Yes.
He was a New York State police sergeant, 12 years younger than Eleanor. He was originally assigned to be her bodyguard when FDR was governor, but he quickly became much more than that.
He taught her how to dive, how to ride horses, how to play tennis. He encouraged her to be physically active.
And historians note that while they might not have had a physical affair in the traditional sense, he was her first intense romantic involvement in her middle years. They maintained a daily correspondence until she died.
Although those specific letters mysteriously vanished from the archives.
Conveniently. So what the historical record shows us is a woman who, having been denied traditional romantic and family intimacy in her own home, actively and deliberately constructed a chosen family.
She built an emotional support system that sustained her, which in turn allowed her to maintain her staggering public schedule. And that schedule was truly the foundation of a modern media empire.
The logistics of her media empire are wild. She was essentially operating like a modern influencer, but in the 1930s.
Yeah, let's talk about the syndication. She writes a daily newspaper column called My Day.
This wasn't a weekly thought piece, right? It ran 6 days a week, nationally syndicated, for almost 30 years.
She writes a monthly advice column for major magazines.
Yeah.
She's constantly communicating directly with the American public. But it's the radio where you see her actual commercial power.
She started hosting her own weekly radio broadcasts, and she recognized her value. When the Selby Shoe Company decided to sponsor her radio program, their national sales increased by 200%.
She was literally moving markets with her voice.
And she transitioned that influence seamlessly into the television era. There is a detail about her doing a television commercial for Good Luck Margarine.
A fitting first lady doing a margarine commercial.
They paid her the modern equivalent of roughly $250,000 for the endorsement.
But she didn't keep a dime of it. She funneled the entire contract directly into her charitable organizations, specifically the American Friends Service Committee.
She figured out how to monetize her celebrity to fund her activism.
But operating at that level of visibility and taking such radical stances on poverty and labor made her an enormous target. She wasn't universally loved.
Right.
The political establishment, particularly the conservative wing, was deeply threatened by her independence and her progressive agenda. And no one viewed her as a greater threat than J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI.
Hoover's obsession with her is fascinating and terrifying. Like, why did he view the First Lady as such a threat that he would actively surveil her?
Hoover absolutely despised everything she stood for. He hated her vocal liberalism, he hated her unapologetic stance on civil rights, and he particularly hated that she publicly criticized his surveillance tactics and the FBI's disregard for civil liberties.
So Hoover retaliated using the tools of his trade. He ordered his agents to build a massive hostile surveillance file on the First Lady of the United States.
It eventually grew to thousands of pages. Agents tracked her activities, scrutinized her friendships, and monitored her correspondence.
Hoover was actively hoping to find compromising material, right? Like maybe definitive proof regarding her relationship with Hickok, or evidence tying her to left-wing communist-adjacent activists.
Exactly. Something he could use to blackmail her, or at least silence her influence on the president.
It is staggering to think about the FBI actively trying to destroy the First Lady, but she refused to be intimidated. She kept pushing boundaries, especially regarding the implementation of New Deal policies.
Which brings us to her role as the driving conscience of the administration, and specifically, the Arthurdale experiment.
Let's talk about Arthurdale. This is a perfect lens through which to view Eleanor's fierce idealism and the limits of that idealism. In 1933, she visited impoverished, blacklisted coal miners in West Virginia.
The conditions were horrific.
She was deeply moved by their desperate poverty and proposed a radical solution, a utopian resettlement community funded by the federal government.
The mechanics of Arthurdale are what make it so controversial. The government would buy the land and build homes equipped with modern conveniences, indoor plumbing, central steam heat, electricity, things these miners had never experienced.
And the idea was that the miners could make a living through subsistence farming, combined with income from small, local manufacturing cooperatives.
Now, Arthurdale is fascinating because your view of it entirely depends on your political lens. And we have to impartially look at all sides here.
Right. Our mission is just to report what the sources say.
Exactly. To fiscal conservatives, it was an alarming government overreach. They condemned it as a socialist intervention and argued passionately against the federal government, using taxpayer money to build towns that competed with private enterprise.
And on the other hand, liberals and even members of FDR's own cabinet, like Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes, criticized it for being wildly inefficient.
Right. The cost of installing modern plumbing in customized homes skyrocketed the per-family cost, far beyond what was sustainable for a national relief program.
Ultimately, the federal government had to sell off the holdings at a significant loss in 1941, and economists generally label the project a financial failure.
But Eleanor viewed the balance sheet completely differently. She measured success in human dignity.
When she was confronted with the staggering $500,000 price tag of the project, she didn't apologize. She looked at her critics and stated, quote, "I don't know whether you think that is worth $500,000, but I do."
And the historical record shows that the residents themselves considered the town a literal utopia compared to the squalor of the mining camps.
However, Arthur Dale also provided a harsh, painful lesson that directly sparked her broader civil rights awakening.
Yeah, this is a huge turning point. Eleanor wanted Arthurdale to be an integrated, racially mixed community. But the project required local approval, and the white miners voted to restrict membership exclusively to white Christians.
She fought them on it, but she lost the vote. Watching Black and Jewish miners get intentionally shut out of a federally funded utopian project really radicalized her approach to race and government relief.
She realizes that structural racism is embedded even in the programs she is helping create. She sees that New Deal relief programs across the South are actively discriminating against African Americans, giving them a disproportionately tiny share of federal money.
So she shifts tactics. She becomes this vocal, relentless force inside the White House demanding equal distribution of benefits, and she starts using her social power.
She begins inviting hundreds of African American guests to White House functions, which was completely unprecedented and shattered deeply entrenched racist Washington protocols.
She really became a master of visual politics. She understood that a photograph of the First Lady could convey a message that a policy paper never could.
Look at the Marian Anderson incident in 1939. The Daughters of the American Revolution, the DAR, owned Constitution Hall in Washington.
And they refused to let Marian Anderson, a brilliant Black classical singer, perform there because of a white artists-only clause.
Eleanor didn't just write a polite letter of disagreement. She publicly resigned her membership from the DR, generating massive national headlines.
And then she and Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes helped orchestrate an enormous, historic, open-air concert for Anderson on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, attended by 75,000 people.
She used the monuments of democracy to shame the racists. I also love how she handled the internal racism of her own staff.
Oh, this is a great story.
She became very close friends with Mary McLeod Bethune, a prominent African-American educator whom Eleanor helped appoint as director of the Division of Negro Affairs for the National Youth Administration.
When Bethune visited the White House, the segregationist staff would routinely try to give her trouble, forcing her to wait or trying to redirect her to the back.
To short-circuit this, Eleanor would personally walk out to the White House gate, physically embrace Bethune in front of everyone, and walk her inside, arm in arm. She was using her physical body and her status to shield her friend and defy the norms of the era.
Another brilliant visual maneuver happened in 1941. The U.S. military was deeply segregated, and the War Department had intense institutional resistance to the idea of Black men serving as combat pilots. They argued they lacked the aptitude.
Eleanor traveled down to the Tuskegee Army Airfield in Alabama. She walked right past the nervous Secret Service agents, got into a Piper Cub airplane with C. Alfred Chief Anderson, an African-American flight instructor, and told him to take off.
He flew her around for half an hour. When they landed, a photograph was snapped of them smiling in the cockpit, and she cheerfully told the press, quote, "Well, you can fly all right."
That single photograph, published nationwide, provided a massive PR victory that helped force the military to fully support the Tuskegee Airmen program.
But this fierce advocacy is where we see the intense friction between Eleanor's idealism and FDR's cold political pragmatism, because there were strict limits to how far Franklin was willing to go, and the most glaring, tragic example of this is the anti-lynching bill.
Yes, Eleanor lobbied fiercely, both publicly and behind the scenes, to pass legislation that would make lynching a federal crime, effectively bypassing the corrupt local sheriffs in the South who were allowing these murders to happen.
She even arranged a private meeting between FDR and Walter White, the head of the NAACP, to plead their case.
But Franklin looks at the congressional math. He explains that to pass his New Deal economic legislation, the programs keeping the country from collapsing, he needs the voting bloc of Southern Democrats in the Senate.
If he openly supports a federal anti-lynching bill, Those Southern Democrats will filibuster his entire economic agenda. So, prioritizing the economy over civil rights, he flatly refuses to publicly support the bill, and it ultimately dies in the Senate.
And we must also acknowledge where the historical record shows Eleanor's own blind spots or political caution overriding her idealism.
Right, impartiality again.
During the war years, A. Philip Randolph, the prominent black labor leader, reached out to Eleanor for urgent help. Boss Crump, the incredibly powerful Democratic machine boss who controlled Memphis, Tennessee, and who happened to be a crucial ally of FDR, was using literal fascist tactics, police intimidation, and violence to suppress free speech and run black Republicans out of town.
Randolph begged Eleanor to intervene and use her influence.
Eleanor replied to him, essentially stating that her advisors had warned her that intervening against Crump might do more political harm than good, and she declined to help.
It perfectly illustrates her complicated role. She was FDR's eyes and ears, traveling to the slums and the coal mines where his wheelchair prevented him from going, but she was also his political lightning rod.
She absorbed the anger of the public. When racial tensions flared, conservative critics blamed Eleanor for stirring up trouble. There were even rumors spread throughout the South about Eleanor clubs, completely fabricated paranoid stories that she was organizing domestic servants to rise up against their white employers.
She willingly took the heat for these progressive causes, which allowed FDR to maintain a more centrist electable image, while she simultaneously pulled the Democratic Party's base closer to minority voters.
That exact political lightning rod status, taking the heat so FDR could govern, was put to the ultimate test when the globe erupted into World War II.
Eleanor's focus shifted massively to the international crisis. As early as the late 1930s, she was pushing hard, often directly against the restrictive immigration policies of FDR's State Department, to allow European Jewish refugees fleeing the Nazis to enter the United States.
Which is a fascinating evolution, because her own private letters from her younger years show that she actually harbored the casual, internalized anti-Semitism common to her upper-class social background.
But as she saw the rise of fascism, her perspective radically shifted. She became a fierce advocate for rescue.
The most famous example is her intervention to secure entry visas for the Jewish passengers stranded on the SS Kwanzaa in 1940.
Her son James later wrote that her failure to convince Franklin to bypass the State Department and accept vastly more refugees was the single deepest regret of her entire life.
During the war, she was constantly pushing boundaries on the home front. She demanded that women be integrated into heavy factory jobs, laying the groundwork for the Rosie the Riveter workforce.
She publicly warned against the racial hysteria following Pearl Harbor, privately opposing FDR's executive order for Japanese-American internment, though she was heavily criticized for eventually defending the administration's policy publicly.
And in 1943, she undertook a brutal, grueling tour of the South Pacific Theater. She traveled 25,000 miles, visiting hospitals, enduring intense heat and austere conditions, specifically to visit the wounded men.
Admiral William Halsey, who was initially furious that a VIP was entering his war zone, later stated that she did more good for the morale of the troops than any other civilian who visited the Pacific.
But the carnage she witnessed on that tour, the shattered bodies of these young men, deeply traumatized her. She is carrying the weight of the nation's suffering.
And then we arrive at April 12th, 1945. The war in Europe is weeks away from ending. FDR is resting at the little White House, his retreat in Warm Springs, Georgia.
He complains of a terrific pain in the back of his head, suffers a massive cerebral hemorrhage, and dies.
The nation goes into profound mourning. But for Eleanor, the historical tragedy of losing the president is immediately compounded by a devastating, apocalyptic personal discovery.
She flies down to Warm Springs to retrieve his body. And as she begins to investigate the exact circumstances of his final hours, she asks who was in the room with him when he collapsed.
And the answer shatters her reality. It was Lucy Rutherford,
The former Lucy Mercer.
the woman who almost destroyed their marriage in 1918, the woman Franklin swore on his political career never to see again. She was sitting right beside him when he suffered the stroke.
But the betrayal goes so much deeper than just Franklin's broken promise.
Yeah.
Eleanor begins to pull the thread, and she discovers exactly how Lucy managed to get to Warm Springs and how they had been maintaining contact for years.
Eleanor discovers that her own daughter, Anna, who had been acting as White House hostess when Eleanor was traveling, fully knew about the ongoing relationship.
Anna had been secretly facilitating these meetings between her father and his mistress. She had been arranging private dinners at the White House for them.
The Secret Service knew, the staff knew. Eleanor realizes that her entire social circle, her own flesh and blood, had actively conspired to humiliate her and hide this from her.
Let's linger on the emotional devastation of that moment. Imagine the psychological toll. Your husband of 40 years is dead, and in the very hours of your deepest grief, you realize your entire life has been surrounded by a coordinated deception.
Most people would have completely broken down. They would have gone to the press, they would have caused a scene, they would have raged at their family.
But look at her response. Look at her remarkable stoicism. She absorbs this staggering emotional blow, and she immediately, almost mechanically, compartmentalizes it. She shuts it in a box. Because the legacy of the Roosevelt presidency and the stability of the American public in the final volatile months of World War II was vastly more important to her than indulging her private grief or her justified anger.
She just locks it away. She meticulously executes Franklin's final instructions. She arranges for the Hyde Park estate to be turned over to the federal government to become a museum, securing his historical legacy.
She packs her bags, quietly moves out of the White House, and relocates to a modest apartment in Greenwich Village.
She genuinely thinks her public life is over. She tells reporters the story's finished. She thinks she can finally just rest.
But of course, the world wasn't done with Eleanor Roosevelt. And that brings us back to where we started our conversation.
President Harry Truman, who has taken over the Oval Office, is facing a terrifying post-war landscape. He knows he needs her moral authority. In December 1945, he formally appoints her as a delegate to the newly formed United Nations General Assembly.
Which leads to her masterpiece. She is appointed to the United Nations Commission on Human Rights, and she is tasked with chairing the specific drafting committee for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
We need to explain the sheer logistical nightmare of this task. She has to manage a committee of 18 members from vastly different political, cultural, and religious backgrounds.
You have brilliant, egotistical legal minds like René Cassin of France, Charles Malik of Lebanon, and Peng Xinchang of China. And more pressingly, you have the Soviet bloc, whose explicit strategy was obstruction.
And Eleanor has to wrangle all of them. She operates with this incredible mix of grandmotherly patience and razor-sharp diplomatic steel.
When the male delegates would drone on with theoretical philosophical arguments, she would firmly rein them in, reminding them of the practical realities of the people suffering outside the room. She forced them to work grueling hours, often driving meetings late into the night.
The Soviet obstructionism is particularly fascinating. There was a massive debate over Article 13, the right of citizens to leave their own countries.
The Soviets, who were actively building the Iron Curtain and preventing emigration, fiercely opposed this.
And Eleanor went toe-to-toe with the Soviet delegates, methodically dismantling their arguments, refusing to compromise on the fundamental freedom of movement.
She pushed, and she pushed, until December 10th, 1948. The General Assembly adopts the Declaration. She famously referred to it as the International Magna Carta of all men everywhere.
And that is when the delegates rise. That is when she receives the standing ovation. The orphan girl who was terrified of the world had literally guided the drafting of the document designed to protect the rights of everyone in it.
It's an incredible climax to her public service. But she still doesn't stop. She remains an absolute source in American politics for another decade.
Look at her later battles. In 1949, she gets into a highly public, incredibly bitter feud with Cardinal Spellman, the most powerful Catholic official in America, over the issue of federal funding for parochial schools.
Spellman publicly accused her of anti-Catholic discrimination, and she fired back with calm, devastating letters defending the separation of church and state, forcing him to eventually seek a truce.
She also took on the corrupt political machine in her own backyard. She battled Carmine DeSapio, the boss of Tammany Hall, which was the notoriously corrupt Democratic political machine that controlled New York politics through patronage and bribery.
Eleanor organized reform candidates and essentially helped force DeSapio out of power by 1961.
And even John F. Kennedy, the rising star of the party, had to bend the knee to her. Eleanor initially had deep reservations about JFK because she felt he hadn't shown enough courage in standing up to McCarthyism, the anti-communist paranoia and blacklisting that swept the 1950s.
Kennedy had to travel to Hyde Park to convince her of his progressive credentials, and he ultimately needed her reluctant but highly vital television endorsement to secure his hairline victory in the 1960 election.
She just never stopped running. Into her late 70s, she is still averaging 150 lectures a year. She is still writing her syndicated daily column.
She is hosting a public television show called Prospects of Mankind, sitting at a table debating complex global affairs with people like Henry Kissinger and Bertrand Russell.
But eventually, her physical body simply gives out.
In 1960, she is struck by a car in New York City, which begins a period of physical decline. She is eventually diagnosed with aplastic anemia, a condition where the bone marrow stops producing new blood cells.
The heavy steroid treatment she received for the anemia ended up activating a dormant case of tuberculosis in her bone marrow. She finally succumbed to the disease and died on November 7th, 1962, at the age of 78.
And the attendance at her funeral in Hyde Park tells you everything you need to know about her stature in the world. President Kennedy was there, Vice President Lyndon Johnson was there, former Presidents Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower were both there.
The entire political machinery of the United States stopped to travel to a rose garden in upstate New York to mourn the First Lady of the world.
When we look at the totality of the historical record, synthesizing this profound psychological journey, we're looking at a woman who, in her private life, felt fundamentally physically unappealing and emotionally unloved.
Her parents died violently and young, her marriage became a hollow political pact, her husband betrayed her repeatedly, and even her own daughter conspired against her.
Yet instead of turning bitter, instead of retreating into the wealth and comfort she easily could have claimed, she took all of that profound unmet need, all of that personal pain, and she poured it outward.
She transmuted her own suffering into boundless empathy.
She became the fiercest protector of the marginalized, the poor, and the oppressed that the world had ever seen. She essentially mothered the world because she felt she couldn't properly mother her own family, and she fought relentlessly for the rights of strangers because her own rights within her marriage had been so easily discarded.
It is an unbelievable alchemy of pain into purpose. And looking at how she leveraged every available medium to achieve that purpose leaves me with a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over.
Think about the sheer mechanical volume of media Eleanor produced in her lifetime. The syndicated daily columns, the radio shows moving consumer markets, the television appearances, the 15-page daily letters, the press conferences.
She understood communication as power. If Eleanor Roosevelt were alive today, right now, with access to modern digital platforms, if she had podcasts, global social media feeds, direct-to-video streaming from her phone, how would her brand of unfiltered, empathetic, direct-to-citizen communication disrupt our current political landscape?
Would the modern political establishment finally embrace her radical empathy? Or, armed with a smartphone and a high-speed internet connection, would Eleanor Roosevelt be even more dangerous to the status quo than she was a century ago?
A truly fascinating question to consider.
Thank you for taking this deep dive with us.
Keep asking questions, keep looking beneath the surface, and never stop questioning the stories you thought you knew.